All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're cutting straight through the political noise to map out the mechanical reality of the recent US and Canada tariff dispute. We're going to look strictly at the economics, tracing the exact cause and effect timeline to see what actually happens when you introduce sudden, massive friction into a highly complex, deeply integrated global market. To do that, we'll hit 5 key areas today: a deeply integrated economy, the tariff collision, the supply chain reality, Canada's strategic shift, and finally, the cost of uncertainty. Let's dive right in. Section 1. A deeply integrated economy, decades of cross-border collaboration. We've got to start by setting the baseline here, because the United States and Canada aren't just distant, disconnected competitors. They are arguably the most intertwined economies on the planet. Factories, farms, energy grids, auto plants, these sectors didn't just pop up overnight. We're looking at decades of deliberate cross-border integration. We share infrastructure, transport systems, and capital. So mechanically speaking, a shock to one side of the border literally vibrates right through to the other. Section 2. The tariff collision, action, and the vicious cycle of retaliation. So how did we actually get to this point? Let's objectively look at the timeline. Trade negotiations basically collapsed in late August, triggering this incredibly rapid reciprocal escalation. On August 22nd, the U.S. hits about $20 billion of Canadian goods with a 50% tariff. Fast forward just 3 days, and Ottawa responds in kind. Plus, we've got this looming threat of another 50% tariff on autos and parts scheduled for January 2027. The whole thing escalated incredibly fast. And what's wild here is the almost perfect symmetry of this dispute. A roughly $20 billion action is met almost immediately by a structurally identical retaliation, about 27.6 billion Canadian dollars. Think about the sheer breadth of those retaliatory targets: steel, aluminum, clothing, appliances, electronics. We're talking over 700 specific categories hit all at once. Now, to really grasp this, we need to understand retaliation in a strict economic sense. Canada isn't levying these taxes just to make American goods more expensive out of spite. Retaliation is the traditional, mechanical response to an initial tariff. One nation levies a tax, the partner responds, and suddenly, boom, both countries are heavily taxing each other's economies, locking themselves into this vicious cycle of friction. Section 3. The supply chain reality, the mechanical journey of a car part. To see why these tariffs matter way beyond the headlines, we have to zoom in on how supply chains actually function. The auto industry is the perfect example. It's like a giant puzzle. A modern North American car isn't just cleanly American or Canadian. Raw materials like aluminum are sourced and processed in Canada. Then, essential engine components are built using those materials down in the US. Finally, the whole thing might be assembled across Mexico or the US. These parts cross borders over and over again. You simply cannot untangle that web with a single policy announcement. $280 billion. That massive figure is the annual intra-USMCA auto trade. Think about the volume of that for a second. It really highlights the staggering financial weight and the massive scale of integration hanging in the balance here, especially with those proposed 2027 auto tariffs hanging over the market. You'll often hear arguments that companies should just bring all their factories home right away. Well, the mechanical reality is a lot more complicated. Actually, scratch that. It's virtually impossible to do overnight. Rebuilding supply chains takes years. It requires billions of dollars in fresh capital, retraining entire workforces, and modernizing transport networks. In the immediate term, tariffs don't magically make foreign inputs disappear. They just make production way more expensive for businesses right here at home. Which brings us to the unavoidable fundamental economic question: if imported inputs suddenly cost more, who actually pays that bill? The reality is, manufacturers facing these higher costs basically have 3 highly unappealing choices. They can absorb it and crush their profit margins, they can reduce their future domestic investments, or, you guessed it, they can pass the costs straight on to us, the consumers. The deep irony of this whole economic mechanism is that when an American manufacturer relies on a Canadian input, a tariff acts as a direct tax on the exact domestic companies policymakers claim they're trying to protect. Section 4. Canada's strategic shift, the economics of diversification. Now, let's look at arguably the most surprising data point of this whole dispute: how Canada is structurally responding. Obviously, Canada has a ton to lose given its massive historical reliance on the U.S. market. But early 2025 data reveals a historic behavioral shift. With all this trade uncertainty, Canada's exports to non-US markets have surged to their highest levels in over 40 years. Basically, when pushed, nations immediately start looking for alternatives. This is where behavioral economics kicks into high gear. In the short term, sure, you get price spikes and a tit-for-tat tariff war. But the long-term impact? That is way more profound. Tariffs fundamentally alter human and corporate behavior. They change where nations and megacorporations look for reliable, stable partners, not just today, but for the next 20 years. What we're witnessing is a fascinating strategic outcome of aggressive trade policy. If Canadian companies decide that relying on the US is just way too volatile, they're going to deliberately restructure their supply lines toward Europe and Asia. So the United States is inadvertently pushing its closest, most integrated partner to intentionally decouple from the American market. And once those new global bridges are built, decades of North American integration might never fully come back. Section 5. The cost of uncertainty. Bargaining chips and long-term consequences. Finally, we need to talk about the broader macroeconomic toll here, well beyond the immediate price tags at the border. Uncertainty itself is economically expensive. Prominent economists like Dr. Steve Hanke are sounding the alarm about renewed inflation right when we're trying to beat it. Why? Because businesses literally cannot plan for the future when the environment is dictated by sudden decrees and unpredictable policy shifts. Put yourself in the shoes of a CEO trying to map out a billion-dollar investment right now. How on earth do you decide? Will this tariff still be here in 6 months? Will the tax suddenly jump from 10% to 50% overnight? Is your product category next on the chopping block? Do you build your new factory in Michigan, Ontario, or Mexico? When the variables keep shifting, the math becomes impossible. Capital freezes up. And when capital freezes, domestic economic growth stalls out for sure. Look, having the world's largest consumer market sitting directly adjacent to a highly developed, resource-rich partner like Canada is a massive geopolitical advantage. But true economic power means knowing when applying leverage actually destroys more value than it captures. You can only spend a bargaining chip of this magnitude once before your partners start looking elsewhere for stability. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought on the mechanics of global trade. The data clearly shows that while protectionism might offer a temporary shield for a specific industry, swapping one tax for another rarely makes a country truly productive or globally competitive in the long run. The central question moving forward isn't just whether Canada can survive the pressure, but rather, can the U.S. impose these massive structural disruptions without ultimately crippling its own manufacturers and consumers in the process? Thanks for learning with us, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.